Okay, welcome to the slideshow entitled Conceptualizing and Measuring Cognitive Affective Social State. In this slideshow, we're going to be looking at a data model of and a technology for the measurement of cognitive affective social state, and then in the second part of the slideshow we'll be looking at the evidence that we've collected using that data technology. So just a bit of context first of all. We are interested in the area of social cognition, and an area of social cognition concerns the study of the relationship between the environment and the mental states of the individuals within that environment. And we might refer to this area of study as human neuroecology. So I've talked about how we are going to look at this particular model of cognitive affective social state. I'm going to introduce and revise the notion of cognitive affective social state as a neural appy, which I'll explain, and describe how technology has been used to develop that. And then, as I say in the second part, to look at the data that's been gathered using the technology. So here's a very central proposal to the concept that we are exploring. Executive function circuits, it is proposed, may serve as a neural appy. API stands for Application Processing Interface, and we will come back to why that term is used. Executive function service may serve as a neural API involved in the integration of multi-structural data. We might call this function cognitive affective social state. So essentially, as an overall diagram that we've got here, we're talking about the ability of the brain to integrate an external data set with its own internal data set. So the external data set, i.e. every bit of data that comes from the environment, and the internal data set, i.e. every bit of data that's held in the brain's memory, has to be integrated together. And this function that we're exploring today, which I'm calling at the moment a neural appy, sits within a neural activity as it's proposed within the brain. Now, let's just have a look at what I mean by this term API. So API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it is an IT term. It is, strictly speaking, a data integrator piece of software that sits between two different data sets, enabling them to transfer data between the two data sets. Now, what does that mean? Well, imagine that you had a set of photographs in Instagram, and you wanted to upload your Instagram photos to your Blogger account, onto your blog. But the thing is that Instagram stores your pictures in a data form, a data structure in Instagram that is different from the structure of data that Blogger uses. So you've got to find a way for these two things to communicate with each other, and that's where an application programming interface, or an API, comes in, because the API pulls data from one data set which is held in one structure. It pulls it in a structure that the API can accept, and then it pushes the data into the second data set, in this case Blogger, in a structure that Blogger can accept. So in this way, the API as a third-party bit of software sits between the two data sets and translates and integrates the two together so that they can share data. So Walker 2014 proposed a model of a neural API which was based around the brain needing to perform 5 functions in terms of this task of integrating external data sets, which may be in multi-structural form, with the internal data set. And I just need to say that there is a separate PowerPoint that deals with the nature of data structure and what is meant by that, and what these 5 different elements actually mean, and the neural circuits involved in those. So that is the neural circuits of the brain PowerPoint, and I'd recommend, if you're interested, that you have a read of that and listen to it. So this slide is really just a summary of what is explained in much fuller detail elsewhere in summary. But Walker proposes this model of the neuroappy, which he claims involves neural activity that has to do these 5 things. First of all, of strain managing, and that's involved with coping with the strain of the external data set not fitting the structure of the internal data set. Secondly, of attentional bias motivating, that's of motivating attention to particular fields of the external data set in order to pay attention to them. Thirdly, memory data integrating, that's updating the search and request and receive criteria that the brain uses to reach out into the external data set, to pull in information on the basis of the continually updating internal memory. Fourthly, internal-external perception switching. This is the choice that the brain has to pay attention to the external environment or to pay attention to the internal environment. In other words, to either detect stimuli or to focus on mentalizing on its own internal thought. And fifthly, what Walker calls efficient solutions control, and that's about the governance of the mental strategies that the brain is going to use to both acquire data and then to process that data, and the governing of how it switches between those mental strategies. And Walker proposes that these 5 functions must be involved in this neural appy model of how the brain must do work to integrate external data that may come in many structures into its internal data set. And he makes it clear that this involves no single brain area, no single brain region, but a range of neural activities governed by various neural circuits. Now, why does he call this whole function cognitive affective social state? Well, he conceptualizes that cognitive affective social state is a way of describing how these set of integrated functions may modulate in the states that they are in, on the basis that any one of these 5 different activities needs to be able to modulate itself in relation to the cognitive demands from different environments. In other words, a static system that was unable to modulate itself would not be able to perform this dynamic integrating function. And Walker proposes that each of these 5 areas is thought of as a data gateway which can exist in a different set of states, and that overall we might think of these 5 different areas as forming a cognitive affective social state which the brain is in, and that state acts as its interface state when it's engaged in a particular cognitive task. And he conceives that therefore cognitive affective social state, CAS state, must be implicated in the ability to learn new things, and he draws the illustration of how one moves from different environments. So for environment 1, there may be a set of gateway states that are effective and optimal for that task, and that's the state of conditions there. But as one moves to a different environment which has different data structures involved in it, then potentially CAS state must be modulatable. It must be able to have the capacity to shift in order to accommodate the different demands of a different environment, because of course we face multiple environments. And so he postulates that a person's ability to adjust their CAS state in relation to the demands of the environment may relate to the ability to learn. And this, of course, describes the ability to learn in close relation to ideas of self-regulation and metacognition. In other words, the brain's ability to think about its own thinking and select the optimal cognitive strategies, approaches to tackle cognitive tasks, and to regulate its switching between those 2 areas, which is why CAS state is described as a component of executive function by Walker. Now, having created this proposal, it sets up a testable hypothesis around the relationship between successful learning and CAS state. So here's a hypothesis that we might be able to test. Successful learners might be expected to show a higher ability to adjust their CAS state to fit the learning task in hand than less successful students. In other words, perhaps the ability to adjust CAS state so that it fits the data task of the situation in hand most optimally is a component of what makes some people successful as learners and some people less successful. So we're interested in testing this hypothesis, and in order to test it we need to develop and select a testable data model, and we need a measurement technology to then measure the CAS state performance of different individuals in different situations. And it's important, number two here, that we measure the CAS state of a person in situ. In other words, when they're engaged in a specific learning task or multiple learning tasks. In other words, not just in an abstract test, because CAS state is a neuroecological concept. It's about how state is potentially modulated depending on the environmental requirements, and therefore different environmental requirements would have to be set up in order to test if CAS state is being modulated. So I want to introduce now the one possible data model of CAS. There would be other data models that could be created, but Walker created one in 2013 and wrote about this in a number of papers in 2014, which involves 7 different factors which relate to these CAS data gateway functions. So on the left hand side here we've got the 7 factors, a brief description in the middle here of the factor, and then the particular gateway function that they relate to in the CAS model. So let me just run through them quickly. The first 2 here are about the individual's trust of their own ideas and of others' ideas. So here is a notion that an individual can bias their attention, if we look over here, on the basis of the degree to which they either trust their own ideas or question their own ideas. So for example, this factor here, which has these 2 bipolarities, enables us to describe how an individual might have a high trust of their own ideas and opinions, and therefore in a lesson environment, if they're in school, they may therefore not be very open to what they might pick up and learn from the lecturer or teacher. And that would be part of a bias, a motivation to bias attention away from that lecturer and towards oneself. If on the other hand one was questioning one's own ideas and opinions in that lesson, then that may be part of the function of biasing one's attention towards the lecturer or the teacher. And that of course would also be related to the second factor here, that if one was trusting of the teacher's ideas and opinions, that again might be a component of how one biases one's attention. So these 2 first factors here relate to this attention bias motivating function of CAS. The third factor here, embracing change, is about the strategy the individual uses to either engage with change and novelty and new ideas, or to resist change and to hold on to a familiar set of ideas and states. And this is related by Walker to the data gateway function of CAS number 1 of managing strain. How one manages when something is strainful, is difficult, is effortful. Does one resist it or does one embrace it? The fourth factor here is called disclosure. Disclosure closely relates to the 4th CAS data gateway function of introspection and external perception switching. And the 2 polarities are the states of either holding back, in other words, holding back one's own ideas and opinions, not disclosing them, or revealing, disclosing them, presenting them, and turning oneself outwards. The 5th, 6th and 7th factors here all relate to the functions 3 and 5 of memory data integration and efficient solutions control, and they are related to cognition, and they're related to whether one pays attention in one's perspective to detached ideas or to personally relevant ideas, whether one connects ideas together or sees them as a singular logical step-by-step sequence, in whether one focuses on the outcome. Sorry, I'll just go back to that. Whether one focuses on the outcome of one's learning, the goal we're trying to work towards, of whether one works in a very open-ended way where the outcome is not predetermined. And Walker claims that all 7 of these factors can be described as bipolar, in which individuals can oscillate from end to end and in medial positions in between, and that therefore we could have a multiple combinations of states of these 7 different factors, which describe a configuration, a set of modulations, if you like, of CAS state in any single situation. And his proposal is that whilst an individual might have a set of configurations of those states, they may be able to adjust those configurations depending on the task in hand. Now, the measurement of CAS state requires distinguishing between mental processing of data structure and mental processing of the data itself. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, CAS is concerned with how the brain copes with discrepancies in data structure and the work involved in that. So the CAS measurement technology must measure neural responses that are to do with handling the structure of data and how that data is being requested and received, and not measure neural activity that's involved in the formation of remote memory and deeper meaning making of the data. So CAS does not implicate meaning making and remote memory formation in its functions. It's concerned with the request and the receipt of data, not what that data then, how that is used and what sense is made of that. And therefore any CAS measure must involve avoiding using cognitively difficult tasks which might discriminate between those who have greater skill in either connecting to internal narratives or internalized memory and knowledge, which therefore might preference those who have a greater internalized memory set already. Because we're not interested, when we measure CAS, in measuring what that data is done with, but how that data is processed in the first place. The technology must also do a second thing. It must measure the request receipt of situational data rather than data in general. So because Walker conceives of CAS state as neuroecological, in other words related to the actual specific environment that the individual is in and the data task required in that environment, then the measurement of it must also be context specific, context dependent. So multiple varied contexts must be assessed in order to distinguish the range of neural activities which are stimulated by each context. And those multiple contexts should involve tasks that are predicted to have different data structures and therefore different cognitive affective social state demands. In other words, if we want to measure CAS state and the ability of an individual to adjust their CAS state for the different cognitive demands, we need to provide them with a range of different data, different contexts which we predict will have different data structures and therefore different CAS state demands. Now, one of the ways that Walker proposes that we might describe a technology to measure such a thing is to exploit the association of what he calls imagined self-operation with actual self-operation. Now, there are lots of studies that show that the regions of the brain which are activated when we imagine an activity are the same regions as when we actually remember performing that activity. The brain, perhaps, Schachter et al. 2007 suggests that the brain projects forward a method of self-operation prior to then enacting that projected sequence. perhaps the brain is acting as a guide or a route map which then directs future action. It's one of the proposals for explaining this neurological function. Now this may provide us with an opportunity here in terms of measurement. We may be able to exploit the fact that imagined cognitive self-operation is a mirror to how an individual would actually operate in a real situation. And this may be an efficient way by setting up a set of simulations to see how an individual may adjust their CAS state given different simulated scenarios. And in this case, we're interested in simulated scenarios in school lessons, which I'll come back to in a moment. So Walker developed a non-real-time neuro-simulation technology to measure this 7-factor model of CAS, and the measure involves candidates participating in an online computer-based imagination activity, and candidates are asked to imagine the characteristics of their mental image of an open space. So literally they are invited through a series of verbal cues to imagine being in an open space and to develop the characteristics of the open space that they see, and that this mental image then provides a mental ground or context against which the candidate's imagined self-operation can then be performed. The assessment then requires the candidates to perform 7 mental operations in relation to, first of all, their ground state, and then a curriculum lesson which they perceive taking place within this ground context that they've imagined. And each of those 7 mental operations is assessed by a 4-item 6-point Likert scale, which the candidate scores, and gives us a score for each of the 7 factors in that represents the CAS state score of that individual in that specific lesson situation. Now, once we've established that, we can then compare 2 data sets. We can compare the candidate's instinctive CAS state and their situational CAS states, plural. So the instinctive CAS state is the kind of resting state that the individual's cognitive affective state, social state, is in when they are not particularly focused on a specific context. So it's a non-situational instinctive resting state, and that serves as a baseline. Our situational simulations, where the candidate has then imagined a particular lesson happening, give us a situational CAS state score which can be compared against the instinctive CAS score. And depending on the lessons that we've assessed, we will get a number of these. So in this test that Walker has used to gather most of the evidence, candidates have done a baseline, and then they've imagined 3 specific learning contexts, math, science and English, in succession in their imagined space, and 3 sets of situational CAS state scores are obtained, which provides a comparative set of data. Okay, so the next question is, what is the population which would be suitable to test this? And secondary school students provide us with a very suitable context for assessing situational CAS states. And there are some good reasons why this population are so suitable. Not least that secondary school involves individuals participating in multiple varied learning contexts, traditionally called lessons. And so those discrete learning contexts that students can bring to mind are very readily available to them. That's what they are engaging in week by week. Not only that, but curriculum lessons involve tasks that we might predict to have different data structures. So for example, a maths lesson, the structure of data in a maths lesson may well be very different from the structure of data in an English lesson or even a science lesson. The structure of data in a maths lesson may be very logical and sequential. In an English lesson it might be much more connective and much more personal or emotional. Different curricular components will have therefore different structures of data which will predominate in those lessons, and therefore we might predict that those lessons have different cognitive, affective, social data demands which the students are having to engage with. So Assessing student CAS state within a set of different learning contexts provides an opportunity to assess mental activity involved in managing and processing multiple independent, distinct data structures. Now, the other advantage of schools is that schools measure other cognitive functions of their students. So, for example, some schools have a measure of general intelligence that they apply to their students. Some schools, well, all schools, will measure academic success in a variety of different ways against standardised levels through tests, exams, assessments, setting, etc. Now, these standardised measures provide reliable measures of successful and unsuccessful learning and learners. So we have established measures of what a successful and unsuccessful learner is, who they are, and we can therefore correlate those measures against the CAS state scores, which we will obtain to see what the relationship, if any, is between the two. So schools therefore provide an ideal context in which to test this hypothesis. The hypothesis that successful learners might be expected to show a higher ability to adjust their CAS state to fit the learning task in hand than less successful students. Just give you a moment to read that through. It's quite an important hypothesis, and it's a testable hypothesis of our CAS proposal. Now, the measure and the test design has been being performed over the last 2 years, and here is just some summary statistics about the test assessment design and the research study methodology. So it's been used in 8 UK schools, a total sample population of 2,000. The schools have been in different sectors, and independent schools, state schools, and different locations. They've involved both primary and secondary school children, principally secondary, but from year 3 up to year 13. It's involved over 5,000 secondary school lesson simulations that these 2,000 children have been engaged in. It's been performed through a standardised procedure for the testing to take place in these schools, and it's been part of what's been known as the Footprints Programme for schools, and schools have not been paid to participate. Data agreements have been provided governing data usage, security, etc. And the studies were mainly conducted, well, exclusively conducted between 2012 and 2014. In addition, in previous years, sorry, I'll just go back, flip on. In previous years, between 2004 and 2009, we also collected CAS state data in an adult population of 800. And the individual CAS state factor scores are, when they're produced and analysed, first of all standardised onto a 0 to 15 scale for each of the 7 factors, and so we get a chart that looks like this for CAS state for a particular context. So this might be instinctive CAS state here, and then we might have a set of 3 other charts that looks like this for an individual of their CAS state when engaged in maths and science and English. As I've said, factor scores are standardised on a 0 to 15 scale, and individual CAS state scores can then be assessed to show variance across different learning contexts. So we can see how their state scores vary from lesson to lesson for a single individual, how their individual CAS state changes, but we can also see how mean CAS state scores for an entire population show variance. So, for example, we can see if a population of a class, maybe 15, 20, 25, 30 children, how their mean CAS state scores might vary from other classes, other sets, how year groups might vary year group to year group, and how whole schools might vary from one school to the other. So we can start to see test this ecological variance of CAS as well. Okay, in the second part of this slide set, I'm going to be talking about the results from our data. Thanks very much. Come back.